February 2024. The U.S. Treasury quietly released a report that most people never read. Foreign ownership of American debt had fallen to 30%, down from over 50% in 2008. In raw numbers, that is a $4 trillion shift away from the dollar in less than 16 years. Countries are not just talking about replacing the dollar. They are doing it, quietly, systematically. And they have been doing it since a secret meeting in 1974 showed them exactly how trapped they really were. I'm Malcolm. Welcome to History Meets Economics, where we follow the money back to where it all started going sideways. Most people think the dollar became the world's reserve currency because America was the most powerful nation on earth. That's the flattering version. The uncomfortable truth is this: the dollar became the world's reserve currency because the rest of the world was burning, and America was the only one holding a fire extinguisher. Then they charged rent for the extinguisher. Then they threatened to take it back if you misbehaved. In the next few minutes, we are going to answer 4 questions that most financial textbooks are too polite to ask. How did America design a system that forced every country to need its currency? Why did the end of the gold standard make the dollar stronger, not weaker? What exact deal was struck in the Saudi desert in 1974 that nobody voted for, but everybody pays for? And why are countries from Brazil to Beijing now building the infrastructure to escape it? Let's go back to how it all started. It is July 1944. The Second World War is not over yet. But Allied victory is close enough that 44 nations send their top economists and finance ministers to a mountain resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They're there because the last time the war ended, the global economy imploded. Trade froze, currencies collapsed, hyperinflation wiped out entire countries. And everyone in that room understood that those economic catastrophes were what made Hitler possible. They weren't just talking about money. They were trying to prevent the next world war by designing financial stability. The document that came out of that meeting, the Bretton Woods Agreement, would become the most consequential piece of paper signed in the 20th century. Not the UN Charter, not the Marshall Plan, this one. To understand why 44 countries signed on the dotted line, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1944. Europe was rubble. Britain, which had been the dominant financial power for nearly 150 years, was essentially bankrupt. They had spent everything fighting Germany. France had been occupied. Japan and Germany were losing. China was in the middle of a civil war. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. And then there was America, untouched. Industrial output had doubled during the war. American factories were producing half of the world's manufactured goods. And most critically, the United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves. 70%. The next largest holder, the United Kingdom, held under 5%. Think about what this means. When the world arrived at Bretton Woods to redesign the global financial system, they walked into a negotiation where America already held most of the chips. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most brilliant economic mind of that generation, tried to propose a neutral international currency, something he called the Bancor, a made-up word for a new idea, a basket currency that no single country controlled. He argued that giving one country's money the status of global reserve currency would hand that country too much power. He was right. He was also ignored, because you don't tell the man with 70% of the gold how to run his vault. I mean, who does that? So here is how the trap was built. 4 steps. Step 1, the peg. Under Bretton Woods, every country agreed to peg their currency to the US dollar. The dollar alone was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This was actually reasonable at the time. It created the exchange rate stability the world desperately needed after years of competitive devaluations and trade wars. Countries accepted it because the alternative had literally contributed to a world war. Step 2, the institutions. The meeting also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF would lend money to countries running out of foreign currency. The World Bank would fund reconstruction and development. Both sounded noble. But here is the fine print that never makes the brochure. Voting power in both institutions was assigned based on financial contribution. And as you guessed, the largest contributor was the United States. America entered with 17% of IMF voting rights, enough to veto any major decision. This was not an accident. This was architecture. Step 3, the dependency. Now, because every currency was pegged to the dollar, every country needed dollar reserves to defend their exchange rates. If the British pound started falling, the Bank of England needed to buy pounds and sell dollars. To sell dollars, you first needed to have dollars, so countries accumulated dollar reserves. And to accumulate dollars, you traded with America, borrowed in dollars, or sold assets priced in dollars. The dollar became the operating system. Every other currency was just an application running on top of it. Step 4. The quiet dominance. By 1950, the dollar accounted for roughly 70% of global currency reserves. American banks handled the majority of international trade financing. SWIFT, the global messaging system for financial transactions, launched in 1973 and was built around dollar-denominated flows. The world's financial plumbing was designed to carry dollars, and America controlled the pump. So take a moment and picture this. It's 1965. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, has had enough. De Gaulle was not a man who suffered indignities quietly. He had watched America print dollars, far more dollars than its gold reserves could actually support, and use those dollars to buy European companies, fund military adventures in Vietnam, and run deficits that no other country in the world would have been allowed to run. The French had a phrase for it, l'exorbitant privilege. In English, the exorbitant privilege. De Gaulle decided to call the bluff. He loaded French francs onto ships. He sent those ships to the United States to exchange France's dollar holdings for actual gold. Physical gold. Because that was the deal. The Bretton Woods agreement said you could do that. Any country could walk up to the window and demand their gold. France was not alone. Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, they all started demanding gold redemptions. Between 1958 and 1971, the U.S. gold reserve dropped from $22 billion to under $10 billion. The vault was draining. America had printed more dollars than it had gold to honor, and the whole world was beginning to notice. On August 13, 1971, President Nixon's senior economic advisors convened in secret at Camp David. The meeting was so sensitive that even Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was not initially informed. They spent the weekend drafting a plan. 7 days later, on Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Effective immediately. No warning, no global consultation, no vote. Just a Sunday night television announcement. De Gaulle's ships had to turn back. There was no more gold window. Here's the simplest way for you to understand what Nixon just did. Imagine you open a restaurant and you tell everyone, our gift cards are redeemable for real food. Anytime, no questions asked. People start collecting your gift cards. Businesses accept them as payment. They circulate like currency. Then one day, you close the kitchen and announce, the gift cards are still valid, but they are no longer redeemable for food. They are worth whatever people believe they are worth. That is what happened to the dollar in 1971. By every rational financial principle, this should have ended dollar dominance. The promise was broken. The gold was gone. The dollar was now fiat currency, backed by nothing but trust and the full faith of the U.S. government, which had just demonstrated in front of 44 countries that it couldn't keep its side of a deal. But what followed defied every rule of money. This didn't destroy the dollar, at least not visibly to the world, because 2 years later, America found something even better than gold. They found oil. Before we get to the deal that replaced Bretton Woods, there is a man who we must not forget to mention. His name is William Simon. He was the U.S. Treasury Secretary in 1974, dispatched on a classified mission to Saudi Arabia, a trip that would not be fully declassified for decades. Simon's mandate was to build what would become the petrodollar system, a quiet arrangement so powerful, so elegantly constructed, that it would make the gold standard look clumsy. Within the U.S. government, there were dissenting voices. Some economists warned that tying the dollar to oil, to the cooperation of a single monarchy in the Arabian desert, was swapping one form of backing for another. That instead of gold sitting in a vault, America's financial dominance would now rest on a political relationship that could collapse at any moment. One internal memo warned of a system of financial dependency that was structurally fragile and geopolitically dangerous. Nobody listened. The deal was too elegant, too profitable, too immediate, and when powerful people have a plan that makes them money today, all warnings about fragility tomorrow rarely change anything. So here is what William Simon and the Saudis agreed to in 1974. And pay close attention, because this is the mechanism that locked every country back into the dollar. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection, weapons sales, and security guarantees to the Saudi government. Saudi Arabia would then take those oil dollars and invest them in U.S. Treasury bonds, lending the money back to America at interest. This arrangement was called petrodollar recycling. And because Saudi Arabia led OPEC, the other oil-producing nations followed. Think about what this means for every country on Earth. Oil is not a luxury. Oil runs factories, powers agriculture, heats homes, fuels militaries. Every country needs oil. And now every country needs dollars to buy oil. not because of any international agreement, not because of any vote, because of one classified deal struck between two governments in 1974. This is the trap condition. Here is a simpler way to put it. Imagine you live in a city with only one gas station. The gas station only accepts one specific credit card, so you need that card to move, to work, to live. The credit card company charges you interest, and at any moment it can cancel your card, cutting you off from fuel, from trade, from survival. You are not in a negotiation with that company. You are at its mercy. That is what the petrodollar system created, and America used it. Swift sanctions could isolate any country from global finance overnight. Dollar-denominated debt gave leverage over borrowing nations. IMF conditions attached to bailout packages could restructure entire economies from the inside. The dollar was no longer just a currency. It was the infrastructure of control. If you ran a country in Africa, Latin America, or Southeast Asia, this is what the system felt like on the ground, you exported all your raw materials, you earned dollars, you used those dollars to pay dollar-denominated debts, you bought oil in dollars, and whatever was left you held in. Dollar reserves, because that's what the system required. If your currency fell against the dollar for any reason, then your debt got more expensive automatically, because the debt was in dollars and you couldn't print dollars. The technical term for what happened to dozens of countries in the 1980s is sovereign debt crisis. The street-level term was more direct. Nations were taken apart piece by piece, assets sold to foreign investors, social spending gutted, all to stay current on loans denominated in someone else's currency. And now we arrive at March 2022. The United States and its allies remove Russian banks from SWIFT following the invasion of Ukraine. They also freeze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, sovereign assets that had been sitting trusted in Western financial institutions. Russia had played the game by the rules. It had accumulated dollar and euro reserves, exactly as the system encouraged. And within 72 hours, those reserves were frozen. Legal teams across the U.S. Treasury, the European Central Bank, and allied central banks worked through the weekend. By Monday morning, the Central Bank of Russia, the institution responsible for stabilizing the entire Russian economy, could not access the bulk of its foreign assets. It was the largest sovereign asset freeze in recorded financial history. The message to every other government on the planet was received in full: your dollar reserves are not truly yours. They are held in trust by a system that can revoke that trust whenever it chooses. That moment was the accelerant. Not the beginning, but the moment the fire became impossible to ignore. Because the countries watching were not abstract actors. They were India, which still carried the memory of IMF conditions in the 1990s that felt less like assistance and more like a hostile takeover. They were Brazil, still bitter from the 2002 crisis, where bailout terms looked suspiciously like the country being priced for sale. They were Saudi Arabia, watching its oil revenue priced in a currency it could not control, while American monetary policy exported inflation into Saudi purchasing power. And they all arrived, separately, at the same conclusion. The dollar system was not just expensive. It was a weapon pointed at anyone who stepped out of line. By 2024, BRICS had expanded from 5 members to 11. Countries representing nearly half the world's population and 40% of global GDP, compared to the G7's 28%. China's CIPS payment system, its alternative to SWIFT, had grown to 1,467 indirect participants across 119 countries. The dollar's share of global reserves had fallen to 57, 8%, a historic low. And foreign ownership of U.S. Treasury bonds, the mechanism through which the whole petrodollar recycling system functioned, had dropped from over 50% in 2008 to 30% in early 2025. None of this happened quickly. It happened because every time the dollar was used as a weapon, another country started building an exit. Tell me in the comments, can we really blame them? Let's return to where we started. February 2024. $4 trillion shifted away from dollar reserves in 16 years. On the surface, that reads like a recent development, a response to tariffs, perhaps, or Russian sanctions. But now you know better. That $4 trillion shift is the accumulated result of 80 years of a system being stretched to its breaking point. Bretton Woods ended in 1971. The petrodollar replaced it in 1974. The weaponization peaked in 2022. And every country that has since started settling trade in yuan, ruble, rupee, or any currency that isn't the dollar is not retaliating. They are exiting. There is a difference. Retaliation is emotional. This is structural. So who won from all of this? Let's name names. Wall Street banks, Citigroup, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs became the dominant processors of global trade finance because international transactions ran through dollar-denominated systems. The Federal Reserve effectively functioned as the world's central bank, with the extraordinary ability to export inflation to dollar-dependent countries while managing domestic stability. U.S. Treasury bonds became the safest asset on Earth, creating a permanent global subsidy for American borrowing costs. Defense contractors profited from the security arrangements built into petrodollar deals across the Gulf. And American governments got to run fiscal deficits that no other country in the world could sustain because the world needed dollars and would keep buying U.S. debt to get them. That exorbitant privilege the French complained about in the 1960s never left. It just changed its name. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the same playbook is still running. When the United States threatens BRICS nations with additional tariffs for pursuing de-dollarization, reducing their reliance on the dollar, that is not trade policy. That is the same mechanism. Use economic leverage to enforce dependency, just with a different label. When the IMF attaches conditions to Global South loans requiring currency convertibility and open capital markets, the structural result is the same dependency that was built into Bretton Woods in 1944. The architecture evolves. The logic does not. The difference in 2025 is that the countries being pressured now have an alternative. In 1974, if you wanted oil, you needed dollars. There was no other system, no other market. Today, Russia and China settle over 90% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. The Shanghai Oil Futures Exchange accepts yuan. SIPS moves money outside SWIFT. The alternative infrastructure is not complete. It is not seamless, but it exists. And once an exit exists, the trap stops being total. In the next video, I will show you what happens when 11 countries representing 40% of the global economy start building the architecture to route around a system that has controlled global trade for 80 years. And I will show you why the United States, for the first time in decades, is responding not from a position of confidence, but from one of fear. I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain why. Here's another moment history met economics.